Let us begin, not with stories of lightning bolts or grand adventures, but with something much quieter. Picture yourself walking along a Roman street, in the dim hush of early morning, where the cobblestones are still cool beneath your feet, and the air is filled with that gentle, ever-present dust that seems to soften every sound. Above you, the tiled roofs of Insula, the Roman apartment blocks, stack awkwardly into the sky, their walls lined with small shrines, niches carved out to house the household gods. You might expect the gods to loom large here in these ancient streets of Rome, but no, they are quieter than you think. They are neighbors you seldom visit. You nod in their direction, as one might nod to an old acquaintance passing by, but there is no need for conversation. Their presence is formal, distant, and yet expected. For the average Roman, the gods were not the fiery beings of epic poems. They were not constant companions, whispering secrets or granting personal favors. Instead, they stood at a formal remove, like silent patrons observing from the other side of an invisible counter. You would acknowledge them, of course. It would be rude not to. A small offering here, a few muttered words there. But the idea of a personal relationship with a god, of sharing emotions or seeking comfort, that was a foreign notion to most Romans. The gods had their roles, just as you had yours, and as long as everyone performed their duties, the world would continue to function in its predictable, orderly way. Imagine, then, the soft clink of coins as they fall into an offering box in a temple's shaded corner. It is a small sound, but in the hush of the temple it echoes faintly, as though marking a transaction. The temple itself is not a place for ecstatic worship or heartfelt confessions. It is a public space. People come and go, their footsteps brushing quietly against the worn marble floors. Offerings are made, not with feverish devotion, but with the calm regularity of paying a fee. A few sips of wine poured out onto the temple steps. A small loaf of bread left on a stone altar. The gestures are brief, efficient, as if ticking items off a daily list. You might expect that entering a temple would feel like crossing into another world, but Roman temples were surprisingly mundane. They were not shrouded in mystical incense or filled with choral hymns. Instead, they functioned as civic spaces. They were used for public meetings, legal proceedings, and even grain storage. The gods had their statues, of course, but even these were often veiled, silent witnesses rather than focal points of fervent worship. You would not kneel before them in private reverence. You would stand, you would perform the necessary rites, and then you would leave, your task completed, your duty fulfilled. For the Romans, religion was not an intimate conversation with the divine. It was a formalized system of rituals, offerings, and observances designed to maintain the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. The gods were like powerful officials in a vast, celestial bureaucracy. You filed your requests through the proper channels. You did not expect them to answer personally. If the fields needed rain, if the army needed favor, petitions were made through public rituals, overseen by priests who ensured every word, every gesture followed precise tradition. The gods, it was believed, cared more for the correctness of the ritual than for the sincerity of the heart. In a Roman home, you would find small household shrines, lararia, where the Lares and Penates, the household gods, resided. These were not grand deities, but guardians of the home's welfare. A Roman might offer them a pinch of salt, a splash of wine, or a piece of cake at the start of a meal. It was not an act of passionate faith, but of habit. Like setting the table or sweeping the floor, it was simply part of the rhythm of life. You did it because it had always been done, and because it was part of keeping things in their proper order. The relationship between the Romans and their gods was marked by this quiet, formal distance. There were no personal revelations, no sudden bursts of divine inspiration. The gods existed in their own realm, and humans in theirs, connected only by the thin thread of ritual duty. The gods were not concerned with your personal joys or sorrows unless those joys or sorrows threatened to disrupt the larger balance of the community. Your personal misfortune was of little consequence, unless it reflected a lapse in proper observance, a crack in the foundation of ritual that needed to be repaired. Imagine the scene during a minor festival. There is no wild revelry, no frenzied crowds. Instead, a slow procession moves through the forum, the priests in their ceremonial garb walking with careful, measured steps. They chant the ancient prayers, their words familiar and formulaic, passed down through generations without alteration. The onlookers watch, not with rapt attention, but with the calm patience of those attending an annual civic event. The scent of burning incense curls lazily through the air, mixing with the more earthly aromas of market stalls and cooking fires. It is a scene not of ecstatic worship, but of tradition, duty, and continuity. The Roman view of the divine was deeply practical. The gods were part of the machinery of the state, their favor essential to the smooth functioning of society. Neglecting them was dangerous, not because of personal offense, but because it risked the collective welfare. If rituals were performed correctly, if festivals were observed, if offerings were made on schedule, then the gods would be content. They would maintain the balance of nature, the success of harvests, the protection of armies. It was a relationship of mutual obligation, not of personal connection. Even the myths, the grand stories of Rome's founding and its heroes, were not treated as living dramas to be reenacted with fervor. They were part of the city's heritage, respected and commemorated, but always with a sense of formal detachment. The tale of Romulus and Remus, the twins suckled by a she-wolf, was remembered in festivals and monuments, but for most Romans, it was not a story that stirred the heart. It was a symbol of Rome's endurance, its rituals forming part of the yearly cycle, a moment to acknowledge before returning to daily routines. In this way, the Roman gods became like the marble statues that adorned their temples, grand, unmoving, silent. They stood watch over the city, distant yet ever present. Their favor ensured not by personal devotion but by the collective adherence to tradition. The gods did not demand love. They demanded respect, precision, and above all, consistency. A mispronounced word in a prayer, a missed offering, a lapse in observance, these were the true risks, the small cracks that could let disorder seep into the carefully maintained structure of Roman life. It is easy to imagine that such a relationship with the divine would feel cold, impersonal. And yet there is a certain comfort in this formal distance. The gods did not intrude upon daily life with unpredictable whims. They remained in their temples, their rituals, their festivals. You knew where they were. You knew what they expected. There were no sudden revelations, no demands for personal transformation. There was only the steady rhythm of tradition, of duties performed, of offerings made. In a world filled with uncertainties, this reliability was its own kind of peace. As you walk once more through the Roman streets, the sun now casting long golden shadows against the walls, you notice again the small shrines, the fading frescoes of gods painted on tenement walls, the quiet alcoves where candles flicker in the dusk. These are not places of passion, of fervent belief. They are markers of habit, of continuity. The gods are there, as they have always been, quietly watching over a city that honors them not with fire and fury, but with the soft, measured cadence of daily life. And now, as we bring this evening's reflections to a close, let the image linger. A temple in the fading light, its doors half open, the soft echo of footsteps on marble, and somewhere in the distance, the faint clink of a coin dropping into an offering box. Tomorrow we will step into the formal offices of the divine. We will see how Rome built a bureaucracy of the sacred, where priests became administrators, rituals became procedures, and the gods remained ever patient, ever distant, quietly waiting for their next carefully scheduled audience. When we think of religion, we often imagine something deeply personal, a private moment of reflection, a whispered prayer, perhaps even a flash of divine inspiration that makes the heart race. But Rome, ancient and enduring, had little time for such things. In the Roman world, the gods were not sought for intimacy, but for order. Their favor was not won through personal devotion, but through the careful, structured machinery of religious offices. Religion in Rome was not a matter of spontaneous faith, it was a bureaucracy, as intricate and methodical as the Senate itself. And so, we now step quietly into this world of officials in white togas, of scribes and augurs, of long, deliberate ceremonies where every word and gesture was recorded, filed, and stored, as though heaven itself required paperwork. The Romans had many religious officials, but none embodied this bureaucratic spirit more than the pontifices, the members of the pontifical college. These were not priests in the sense of wandering mystics or passionate preachers. They were administrators. Their task was to oversee the proper observance of religious rites, to maintain the calendar of festivals, to regulate the construction and maintenance of temples, and to ensure that the complex relationship between the gods and the city of Rome remained in careful balance. They did not seek visions, they kept records. They did not perform miracles. They ensured that the sacred fire remained lit, that the prayers were said in the right order, and that no detail, however small, was forgotten. Imagine, if you will, the quiet office of a pontifex, seated at a heavy wooden desk piled with wax tablets and scrolls. He dips his stylus carefully, recording the results of the latest augury, not as a prophet, but as a clerk noting the outcome of a routine inspection. Perhaps a magistrate had requested a reading of omens before a public assembly. The augur would have stood beneath the open sky, staff in hand, watching the flight patterns of birds, interpreting their movements with a precise, inherited vocabulary. There is no sense of mystic revelation here. The augur does not claim sudden insight. He observes, records, and submits his report. Another line entered in the vast, dusty ledger of Rome's sacred affairs. The augurs, with their curved staffs, latus in hand, did not tell the future in the way we might imagine. They did not predict personal destinies. Their task was to determine whether the gods approved of public actions. Before elections, before battles, before the laying of a foundation stone, the augurs would take the auspices. They would observe the heavens, the birds, the clouds, and through this structured ritual, they would declare whether the moment was ritually appropriate. It was not about the will of a passionate deity speaking through visions. It was a matter of procedure, a checkmark on the list of things that must be done before proceeding. And then there were the flamines, the priests of specific gods. Each major deity had their own flamen, whose entire existence revolved around the performance of that god's rites. The flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter, lived a life of detailed restrictions and obligations. He was not allowed to spend a single night outside the city. He could not touch iron, ride a horse, or even see a dead body. His life was not one of ecstatic communion with the king of the gods, but a meticulous adherence to rules, a daily checklist of what must and must not be done. His very presence was a ritual, a walking embodiment of religious obligation. One might imagine that the Vestal virgins, with their sacred duty of tending the eternal flame of Vesta, lived a life of spiritual ecstasy. But in truth, their days were filled with routine. From dawn until dusk, they swept the temple floors, maintained the flame, and prepared the offerings. They lived under strict vows of chastity, not as an act of personal devotion, but because the purity of the city's sacred fire was believed to depend on it. Their existence was ceremonial, structured, and utterly public. They were not cloistered in quiet contemplation. They were part of the city's daily rhythm, moving through the forums and temples like serene officials in a grand, endless ceremony. Every ritual, every offering, every festival followed prescribed formulas, known as ius divinum, the divine law. There was no room for improvisation. Even the wording of prayers was fixed, recited in precise, archaic Latin, whose phrases were often so old that their meanings were no longer fully understood. But the words had to be said, in the right order, with the right inflections, because the gods did not listen to intent, they listened to correctness. A single mispronounced syllable could invalidate an entire ceremony, forcing the priests to begin again, repeating every step until perfection was achieved. Public sacrifices were equally procedural. A bull or sheep might be led to the altar, not amid cries of spiritual fervor, but to the slow, deliberate rhythm of a ceremony that had been performed thousands of times before. The animal was adorned, its horns gilded, its body sprinkled with salted flour. A flute player played softly, not to create atmosphere, but to drown out any ill-omened noises that might interrupt the rite. The priest, with a veil drawn over his head, would offer the prayer, carefully avoiding any mistakes. Only then would the sacrifice be made, and even in death, the animal's entrails would be examined, not for mystical insights, but for signs of divine approval. The liver, in particular, was studied with meticulous care, its markings compared to models stored in temple archives. It was a report, a data point, a sacred bureaucratic memo sent up the chain. This system extended even into Rome's calendar, which was itself a religious document. The pontifices maintained the official calendar, determining which days were nefas, days on which public business could not be conducted due to religious observances, and which were fas, days when affairs of state could proceed. The calendar was not simply a tool for tracking time. It was a living framework that dictated the rhythm of civic life, marking out festivals, market days, and periods of ritual purification. The city itself breathed according to this divine schedule, moving from one obligation to the next, with the pontifices acting as its timekeepers. Religious offices in Rome were often filled by men of political ambition. Being an augur, a pontifex, or even the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, was as much a political stepping stone as a sacred duty. Julius Caesar, long before his rise to absolute power, was elected Pontifex Maximus. It was a position of influence, of visibility, and of control over Rome's spiritual bureaucracy. But even for men of such ambition, the role was not one of personal spiritual awakening. It was an office. Duties had to be performed, ceremonies presided over, calendars maintained. The gods were distant, formal entities, and the priests were their administrators. What emerges from this picture is a religion of profound structure, a faith not of passion, but of order. Rome's gods were guardians of stability, and their favor was not capriciously given through emotional pleas, but secured through adherence to ritual law. It was a transaction, a contract. The gods upheld their end of the bargain, ensuring the city's safety and prosperity, so long as the Romans upheld theirs, with precise, tireless attention to the details of rites, prayers, and ceremonies. It was a relationship that demanded vigilance, not inspiration. Even the spaces of worship reflected this bureaucratic spirit. Temples were not places for spontaneous gatherings of the faithful. They were structured, official spaces, often closed to the general public. Sacrifices and ceremonies took place on the temple steps, outside the main sanctuary, with only priests allowed within. The gods did not desire crowds. They desired process, performed correctly, without error. The average Roman citizen would stand at a respectful distance, watching the ceremony unfold as a civic spectacle rather than a spiritual communion. And yet in this very structure, there was a kind of peace. The gods were distant, yes, but they were reliable. There were no sudden, unpredictable revelations to disrupt daily life. Everything was scheduled, organized, and codified. The rituals, the festivals, the prayers, each followed its place in the calendar, creating a rhythm that connected the people to their gods through routine rather than rapture. The gods did not need to be exciting. They needed to be consistent. As the evening shadows lengthen and the soft murmur of daily life fades into a gentle hush, It is easy to imagine the quiet satisfaction of a city that has completed its sacred duties for the day. The priests have recorded their rituals, the augurs have filed their omens, and the sacred fires burn steadily in their marble hearths. The gods, in their distant, celestial offices, have received the paperwork. The city breathes evenly, cradled in the slow, repetitive heartbeat of its religious bureaucracy. And so, as we bring this evening's reflections to a close, let us leave the marble halls of the pontifices behind and step into the myths themselves, not the wild, thrilling versions sung by poets, but the slow, ritualized stories as the Romans remembered them. Tomorrow we will begin the tale of Romulus and Remus, not as an adventure, but as a festival, as a memory carved slowly into stone, one chisel strike at a time. We begin now with a story you have heard before. It is a story of wolves, twins, rivers, and kings. A story so old that its edges have softened, like a statue whose marble face has been worn smooth by centuries of patient wind and rain. It is the founding myth of Rome. And yet, in the quiet routines of Roman life, this story was less of a thrilling legend and more of a formal backdrop, a tale revisited during festivals and ceremonies, spoken with the same gentle cadence year after year. The Romans did not need the story to surprise them. They needed it to endure, to repeat itself faithfully, like the sunrise or the clink of coins in an offering box. The twins, Romulus and Remus, were born into a world of duty and consequence long before they were wrapped in legend. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin bound to chastity by sacred oath. And yet, the god Mars, whether through divine will or mythic convenience, fathered the twins. This was not a tale of romance or passion, but of obligation and consequence. The birth of Romulus and Remus was not seen as a scandalous affair, but as an inevitability, a necessary disruption that would be absorbed into the slow machinery of Roman tradition. The gods had their plans, and mortals, whether willing or not, became part of the paperwork. Ordered to be drowned in the Tiber by a fearful king, the twins were placed in a basket, set adrift upon the river's gentle current. The image is familiar, yet the Romans did not imagine this moment with suspense. There was no urgent chase, no dramatic rescue. The river, to them, was a presence as calm and unchanging as the gods themselves. The Tiber flowed as it always did, carrying the twins not toward danger, but toward their place in the city's inevitable story. The she-wolf who found them, crouching beneath the roots of a fig tree, was not the snarling beast of modern imaginations. In Roman thought, the lupa was both literal and symbolic. A wild animal, yes, but also a symbol of nurturing strength, of Rome's untamed origins being cradled by nature itself. The image of the she-wolf suckling the infants was not meant to shock. It was a familiar emblem, a quiet reminder of Rome's raw, natural beginnings. Festivals would later commemorate this scene, not with wild reenactments, but with solemn processions, statues unveiled beneath banners, fluttering gently in the afternoon breeze. In the early days of Rome's festivals, the story of Romulus and Remus was less about heroic adventure and more about origins and boundaries. Romans were obsessed with boundaries, the walls of the city, the edges of fields, the limits of sacred spaces. The myth of the twins, nurtured in the wilderness, returning to build walls and mark the sacred boundary of Rome, was a narrative reflection of this civic preoccupation. Every February, during the Lupercalia festival, priests known as Luperci would run through the streets, striking bystanders gently with strips of goat hide, a symbolic act meant to purify and invigorate. But even this, wild as it might seem, was ritualized, formulaic, and expected. The people knew where to stand, when to laugh, when to accept the light touch of the leather lash. It was a festival, yes, but also a duty, part of the quiet machinery that kept Rome in harmony with its past. As Romulus and Remus grew, raised by a humble shepherd and his wife, the myth becomes a tale of disputes over leadership, of rival visions for a city not yet born. But these are not the passionate debates of fiery revolutionaries. In the Roman telling, they are measured disputes over procedure and precedence. Which hill should the city be built upon? Who had the favor of the gods? These questions were not matters of inspiration, but of augury, of omens, of structured signs observed by trained priests. Romulus watched 6 vultures. Remus saw 12. The numbers were debated, not with emotion, but with the calm detachment of men reading entries in an official log. When Romulus finally began to mark out the sacred boundary of his new city, plowing a shallow furrow with a yoke of oxen, the act was not grand or dramatic. It was a ritual. Slowly, steadily, the plow traced the pomerium, the sacred line that would define the city's heart. Every turn of the soil was a gesture of both physical labor and religious significance. The furrow was not merely practical, it was legal, sacred, and enduring. In this act, Romulus was not just founding a city. He was performing a rite, filing a sacred deed in the celestial records. Remus, in the story, mocks his brother's wall, leaping over the newly made boundary. This is often told as a moment of defiance, a flash of sibling rivalry. But to the Roman mind, it was more than a personal insult. It was a breach of ritual propriety, a failure to respect the sacred process of boundary making. The act of crossing the line was not merely physical. It was a violation of the established order, a disruption of the careful balance between human duty and divine observance. Romulus's response striking down Remus was not seen as a murder of passion. It was, in the Roman narrative, an enforcement of order, a grim necessity to preserve the sanctity of the city's foundation. The moral was not about jealousy, but about the inviolability of boundaries. Afterward, Romulus stood alone, the first king of a city that would grow not through legends, but through laws. His first acts were not of conquest or glory, but of administration. He established the Senate, selecting 100 elders, known as patres, the fathers of Rome. He opened an asylum on the Capitoline Hill, inviting exiles, fugitives, and wanderers to populate his new city. These were practical, civic actions, not grand, mythic adventures. The founding of Rome, as the Romans remembered it, was not an act of divine epiphany, but a slow, procedural establishment of structures, laws, and rituals that would endure for centuries. Festivals commemorated these origins, not with dramatic plays, but with parades, offerings, and carefully observed ceremonies. The Perilia, celebrated on April 21st, marked the birthday of Rome. On this day, shepherds and farmers would offer prayers to Pales, the god of flocks and herds, asking for the purification of their animals and lands. Bonfires were lit, but not in wild revelry. Participants leapt over the flames in quiet procession, a symbolic cleansing, a reenactment of the city's humble, pastoral beginnings. There was no need for theatrical retellings. The gestures themselves, performed as they had always been, were enough to keep the story alive. The slow beat of festival drums would echo across the forum, not in a rousing crescendo, but in a steady, measured rhythm, as if keeping time with the heartbeat of the city itself. The scent of incense would drift lazily through the air, mixing with the more earthly smells of olive oil, bread, and livestock. Offerings of grain, wine, and salt cakes were presented to the gods not with cries of passion, but with the quiet reverence of citizens fulfilling their part in a grand, unspoken contract. In the carving of monuments, too, the story of Romulus and Remus found its place. Sculptors would etch their images into stone, not as dynamic figures frozen mid-leap or mid-battle, but as calm, balanced symbols. The she-wolf nursing the twins became a motif, reproduced not to stir emotion, but to affirm identity. Each chisel strike was a small, deliberate act, as much a ritual of remembrance as the festivals themselves. The Romans understood that stories could be fragile things, easily distorted by too much embellishment. And so they preserved their myths not in the breathless urgency of bardic performances, but in the slow, repetitive motions of ritual and routine. The tale of Romulus and Remus was not meant to thrill, it was meant to endure. Like the walls of the city, It stood firm, each festival, each offering, each quiet recitation reinforcing its foundation. And now, as the evening settles and the lamps are lit in the doorways of Roman homes, we leave the twins resting once more beneath the fig tree, cradled by the soft earth, the murmuring river, and the steady gaze of distant, watchful gods. Tomorrow, we will walk along the newly traced walls of the city and witness a quiet moment of transgression. A single leap, a quiet murder, and the slow, ceremonial remembrance of boundaries kept and broken. In the soft haze of early morning, when the light drifts slowly over the hills of Latium and the shadows of the past linger like faint impressions upon the soil, we return to the figure of Romulus. He stands with a plow in his hands, the wooden handles worn smooth by hours of labor, the iron blades sinking lazily into the earth. Around him the land is quiet. The air smells of tilled soil, of crushed grass, of the faint smoke from distant hearths where the first breads of the day are baking. There is no crowd to watch, no fanfare. The founding of a city, in the Roman mind, is not a moment of wild celebration, but a slow, careful act of marking boundaries, sacred lines traced in furrowed earth, each turn of the plow a gesture both mundane and monumental. Romulus is not alone. Beside him walk attendants, shepherds, and a few of the city's earliest settlers, each watching in respectful silence. This is not a moment for speeches. It is a ritual. The furrow he traces is not just a wall. It is the pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, a space that would forever separate the mundane from the divine, the city from the wilderness. The plow is lifted at certain points, to leave deliberate gaps where gates will one day stand, thresholds where the divine protection of the city pauses to allow passage. Every step, every furrowed line, every lifted plow is performed with methodical care, as though the gods themselves are auditors, observing each action, ready to mark a ledger if something is amiss. This, the Romans believed, was how a city was born, not through conquest or inspiration, but through the quiet observance of rites that linked heaven and earth. The wall itself was not meant to be a towering fortification. In its earliest days it was barely more than a ditch, a symbolic line in the soil, but it was sacred, inviolable, not because of its height or strength, but because it had been traced with the correct rituals, under the correct omens, with the correct words whispered at the correct times. It was a legal boundary, a spiritual threshold, and to the Romans that made it stronger than any stone wall. Yet myths, even in their quietest forms, carry moments of rupture. The story tells us that as Romulus plowed the city's boundary, his twin brother, Remus, stood nearby, watching. Perhaps he was amused, perhaps impatient, perhaps simply fulfilling his role in the story. The myths do not give us Remus's thoughts. They give us his action. He leaps over the furrow. A simple, careless jump. A footstep that disregards the invisible wall. A transgression so small, so ordinary, that it could be mistaken for play. But in Rome, boundaries were never casual. They were sacred contracts, and even a single step could be an act of defiance. Romulus's response, as the story goes, is swift. He strikes down his brother. Not in a fit of rage, not with a dramatic outburst, but with a calm, necessary blow. The myth, as retold by Roman scholars, frames this moment not as fratricide, but as an enforcement of divine order. Remus, by leaping over the wall, has broken the sanctity of the city's foundation. In Roman thought, this is not merely a personal insult. It is a legal violation, a religious offense that demands correction. And so, Romulus acts, not as an enraged sibling, but as the first magistrate of Rome, upholding the sacred laws of space and order. There are no mournful laments recorded for Remus. The myth does not dwell on his burial or his legacy. Instead, the story moves quietly forward, as though his death, while tragic, was a necessary formality in the paperwork of Rome's birth. This is how the Romans remembered it. Not with drama, but with solemn recognition. The city's foundation required boundaries, and boundaries required enforcement. In the centuries that followed, this quiet act of violence would be commemorated not through grand monuments, but through rituals and ceremonies that echoed its themes. The ancient Roman festival, known as the Parilia, though primarily a pastoral celebration, carried within it the echoes of the city's sacred beginnings. On this day, shepherds would drive their flocks through fires, leaping over the flames themselves in a symbolic act of purification. The image of leaping, so central to Remus's fatal transgression, was recast here as a ritual of renewal. It was as if each jump over the fire was a quiet apology to the boundary once crossed, a respectful gesture to remind the people of the lines they must not forget. Even the formal founding of new Roman colonies followed echoes of this ancient act. When Rome expanded its reach and established new cities, officials known as augurs and priests would perform the same ritual of boundary tracing. A furrow would be plowed, a pomerium declared. It was a direct reenactment of Romulus's act, each new city an echo of that original furrow traced beneath the soft morning light of the Palatine Hill. The myths were not retold with flourishes, they were reenacted with precision, folded into the routines of urban planning and civic administration. The Romans carved their stories into stone with the same patience. Reliefs and sculptures depicting Romulus and Remus often placed them in quiet, balanced compositions. The she-wolf stands, steady and calm, the twins beneath her in a symmetrical pose. The act of the murder is rarely, if ever, depicted with violence. Instead, the images that survive prefer to linger on the serene symbolism of the twins' bond, the walls of Rome rising slowly in the background. For Romans, the story's lesson was not found in the act of the murder, but in the consequence. The establishment of order, the protection of sacred spaces. One can imagine during festivals the slow shuffle of feet across the forum as magistrates and priests, draped in formal togas, moved through the rituals of remembrance. Perhaps a public speaker would stand before the gathered citizens, recounting the story of Romulus and Remus, not with the zeal of a bard, but with the calm cadence of a man reading from a well-worn scroll. The people would listen, not for entertainment but for affirmation. The story was not meant to thrill. It was meant to remind, to reaffirm the boundaries that kept the city aligned with the will of the gods. Even in the legal practices of Rome, the theme of sacred boundaries endured. The pomerium, once traced by Romulus, remained a vital legal concept. It defined not only the city's sacred space, but also the limits of civic authority. No general, however powerful, was allowed to bring his army across the pomerium into the city without specific, ritual permission. This boundary, first plowed in silence, became a legal firewall that protected Rome from the very military power that had built its empire. The story of Remus's leap and Romulus's enforcement became a quiet, living principle embedded in the city's legal code. In the end, the Romans did not need to retell the story with passion or embellishment. Its lessons were etched into their rituals, their laws, their festivals, and even the physical layout of their city. The murder of Remus was not a tale of brotherly jealousy, but a symbolic act that defined the Roman relationship with space, order, and duty. As we now leave this quiet chapter behind, the image that lingers is not of conflict, but of a man standing alone at the edge of a furrow, the freshly turned earth marking the beginning of a city that would grow, layer by layer, through the steady repetition of rituals. The boundary has been defended. The city has been born. The paperwork has been filed with the gods. And so, as the sun dips slowly behind the Aventine Hill, casting long, sleepy shadows across the city's nascent streets, we prepare to meet one of Rome's oldest patrons, a god who embodied not war or passion, but the quiet rhythm of seasons and harvests. Tomorrow, we will walk softly into the story of Mars, not the glamorous war god of later myths, but the orderly, agricultural deity whose rituals echoed through Rome in the slow clang of bronze shields and the gentle dance of priests in temple courtyards. When we hear the name Mars, The mind stirs with images of battlefields and crimson banners, of swords raised high beneath a burning sun. The very word feels heavy, loud, sharp with the clangor of war. But to the ancient Romans, Mars was not always the god of blazing glory or violent conquest. Before he was draped in the armor of empire, he was a quieter, steadier figure. A god of boundaries, of fields, of growth, and of the patient rhythms of the land. In the earliest memories of Rome, Mars was not a warlord charging into chaos, but a guardian of order, a deity whose rituals were performed not on the battlefield, but in the furrowed rows of farmland and the shaded courtyards of temples. It is difficult, perhaps, to imagine a god of war whose earliest worship was tied to the planting of crops, but for the Romans, the line between war and agriculture was a soft, blurred boundary. The plow that cut through soil was not unlike the spear that would defend it. Both were tools of order, instruments that imposed human intention upon a wild and unpredictable world. Mars, as a protector of the fields, was invoked not with cries of conquest, but with formal prayers, requesting his guardianship over the fragile balance between cultivation and destruction. One of the most ancient priestly colleges in Rome was dedicated to Mars, the Sali, or leaping priests. Their rituals were peculiar, and yet, in their quiet, repetitive form, they carried the weight of centuries. Each March, in the early days of spring, the Sali would perform their slow, rhythmic dances through the streets of Rome. Draped in archaic costumes, their tunics bound with bronze belts, they moved in a procession that was neither hurried nor chaotic. In their hands, they carried the ancilia, sacred shields, oval in shape, their surfaces gleaming dully beneath the filtered light of Roman mornings. The sound of the Sali was not a battle cry. It was a soft, hollow clang, the measured strike of shield against shield, the echoing rhythm of bronze meeting bronze, like a heartbeat pulsing through the city's stone arteries. The priests sang hymns, their Latin words ancient and mysterious even to the Romans themselves. The verses were so old that their meanings had become obscure, passed down from tongue to tongue with a reverence that did not require understanding. The ritual itself was enough. It was the performance, the continuity, the unbroken chain of gestures that mattered. The streets of Rome would pause as the Sali passed. Citizens, accustomed to the solemn beat of the shields, would watch from thresholds and balconies, not with the excitement of spectators, but with the quiet respect of participants in a civic ritual. The procession marked the transition of seasons, a formal request to Mars to guard the fields, the city, and the fragile peace of early spring. It was not a celebration of war, but a safeguarding of order, a reminder that chaos, whether in the form of invading armies or failing harvests, was always close, always requiring vigilance. Even the ancilia, those sacred shields, were not weapons of war, but symbols of divine protection. According to legend, one of these shields had fallen from the heavens during the reign of King Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king, a man who, unlike Romulus, was remembered not for violence, but for rituals, laws, and temples. The shield from the sky was considered a token of the god's favor, and to protect it, 11 identical copies were crafted, so perfectly matched that no one could discern the original. The Sali carried these shields in their processions, a dozen in all, ensuring that the divine emblem was concealed among its replicas, guarded not by secrecy, but by symmetry and ritual. Mars's presence in daily Roman life was felt more in these quiet acts than in the noise of battle. His temples were not places of fervent worship, but of formal observance. The most ancient temple of Mars stood outside the city's sacred boundary, beyond the Pomerium, because war, as a force of chaos, could not reside within the protected heart of Rome. Soldiers, before departing for campaigns, would gather at the temple, not in frenzied rallies, but in orderly assemblies. They would offer sacrifices, perform the prescribed rituals, and wait for the augurs to read the will of the gods. Only when the signs were favorable would they march, their movements choreographed by tradition as much as by command. In the Roman calendar, Martius, was named for Mars, not because it was a time of immediate battle, but because it marked the reawakening of activity, both in the fields and in the armies. It was the season when life returned, when boundaries were to be guarded anew, when both plows and spears were readied after the stillness of winter. The festivals dedicated to Mars in this month were numerous, each a quiet rehearsal of the city's pact with its guardian deity. There was the Equirria, a horse racing festival held in the field of Mars, where chariots would race not for entertainment, but as a ritual performance, their wheels turning in patterns that symbolize the cycles of war and peace. The priests, the flamines martialis, would oversee sacrifices not in the heat of passion, but in the cool detachment of duty. A pig, a sheep, and a bull, the suovitorilia, were the customary offerings, led slowly through the city in a procession that was as much a civic event as a religious one. The sacrifice was not a bloody spectacle, but a formulaic ritual, its steps recorded meticulously, observed with care to ensure that each word, each gesture, followed tradition. For the Romans, the gods were not swayed by emotion. They were bound by contract, by the correct observance of rites, the proper fulfillment of obligations. Even in military triumphs, Mars's role remained formal and detached. When victorious generals returned to Rome, they would dedicate a portion of their spoils to Mars, offering weapons, armor, and standards in quiet ceremonies. These were acts of restitution, of balance, ensuring that the chaos of war was tempered by acts of order. The spoils were not paraded with wild abandon, but presented in temples, arranged neatly, catalogued as much for the gods as for the city's records. Over time, as Rome's empire expanded and Mars became associated more explicitly with conquest, the older, quieter aspects of his worship remained embedded in the city's routines. New temples were built, such as the Temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, commissioned by Augustus after the civil wars. Even here, amid the marble grandeur, the rituals continued with the same measured pace. The statues were grander, the spaces more opulent, but the priests still performed the same chants, the same offerings, the same careful readings of omens. The gods, after all, remained indifferent to human ambition. They demanded consistency, not spectacle. For everyday Romans, Mars was not a distant, fiery god of wrath. He was present in the small daily acts of observance, the quiet prayers offered before setting out for the fields, the careful maintenance of household shrines, the respectful attention given to the slow procession of priests through the streets. His presence was felt in the steady rhythm of shields clashing in ritual, not in the chaos of battle. The gods, to the Romans, were part of a bureaucracy older than the city itself, their favor secured not through passion, but through paperwork written in the language of rituals and contracts. As the day faded, and the city settled into the soft hum of evening, the echoes of Mars's rituals would linger, not as anthems of war, but as reminders of order preserved, of boundaries respected. The shields of the Salii, resting now in their sanctuaries, would gleam faintly beneath the flicker of oil lamps, their silence as significant as their earlier clamor. In Rome, the gods were always watching, but from a distance, content to observe as long as the rituals continued, as long as the people performed their part in the ancient, unspoken agreement. And so, as night descends over the quiet courtyards and the marble steps of Mars's temples cool beneath the moonlight, we leave the war god not in battle, but in the soft, deliberate rhythm of rituals performed correctly, a guardian of order whose presence was felt not in the heat of passion, but in the steady, calming beat of bronze against bronze. Tomorrow, we will step into a different kind of story, one that sinks into the soil, into the fields and cycles of life and death. We will meet Ceres, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Proserpina, whose tale of loss and return was less a myth of drama and more a reflection of the slow, repetitive patience of the Roman earth. The Roman countryside does not awaken quickly. Morning in the fields comes not with grand proclamations, but with a slow exhalation of mist rising from furrowed rows of earth. There is a softness to the light as it slides across the plains, brushing the leaves of olive trees, warming the terracotta rooftops of distant farmsteads. In this quiet, where the hum of insects is the only music, we find the goddess Ceres, not as a towering, radiant figure, but as a presence folded gently into the soil, woven into the daily rhythms of planting and harvest. For Romans, Ceres was not a distant Olympian deity. She was the patron of the grain, the custodian of bread, the quiet overseer of life's most essential yet most ordinary task, feeding the city. The story of Ceres and her daughter Proserpina was known well enough, though its Greek origins, where Ceres appears as Demeter and Proserpina as Persephone, were softened, simplified, and folded into Roman life without urgency. The tale, like many myths, was not retold for its drama, but for its reflection of the slow, cyclical pace of the earth itself. Proserpina's abduction by Pluto, the god of the underworld, was not, in Rome, a grand, tragic event filled with cries and storms. It was a quiet shift, a turning of a season. She simply disappeared, descended into the earth, much like a seed pressed beneath the soil, vanishing from sight, only to return when the time was right. Ceres, in the myth, searched for her daughter. But in Roman imagination, this search was not a frenzied quest. It was a slow, methodical wandering. One can almost see her walking the dirt paths between villages, her feet dusted with the fine powder of tilled fields, her hands brushing gently against the tops of barley stalks. The Romans did not picture their gods sprinting across the skies or hurling lightning. They imagined them walking at the pace of life, steadily, endlessly, their divine duties as repetitive and patient as the labors of the farmers who revered them. When Ceres mourned, the earth reflected her grief, but not in violent, catastrophic ways. Crops withered slowly. The fields, without their divine patron's blessing, grew quiet. It was not destruction, it was a pause, a stillness. The seasons in Rome were not battles between gods, but agreements, contracts that turned over and over with the reliability of a farmer's calendar. Proserpina's descent into the underworld was a metaphor not for loss, but for waiting. Every seed planted was, in a way, a reenactment of that story. A small act of disappearance, followed by a long, patient anticipation of return. The rituals dedicated to Ceres were not extravagant. They were embedded into the ordinary acts of daily life. The Cerealia, a festival held in her honor, was marked not by feasts or processions of grandeur, but by simple offerings of grain, honey cakes, and wine. Farmers, before the planting season, would scatter grains on small household altars, mumbling familiar prayers that had been spoken in their family for generations. These prayers were not performed with theatrical passion. They were practical, whispered like a checklist. Bless the fields, ensure the crops, bring Proserpina back. There was no question of whether the gods listened out of affection. The key was to perform the ritual correctly, to fulfill one's end of the contract. At the public level, the Temple of Ceres on the Aventine Hill served not only as a sacred space but as a bustling hub of civic activity. Unlike the serene, elevated temples of other deities, the Temple of Ceres was close to the grain markets, its steps worn smooth by the passing of merchants and magistrates. It was here that the plebeians, the common citizens of Rome, gathered to discuss civic matters, settle disputes, and, when necessary, seek the goddess's favor for their most basic needs: grain supplies, fair prices, a stable harvest. The temple stored records, hosted assemblies, and at times functioned more like a community hall than a site of mystical revelation. Within the temple, statues of Ceres would stand serene, their expressions carved not with grandeur, but with the calm, composed dignity of a matron managing her household. To the Romans, the gods were caretakers, stewards of order, and Ceres, perhaps more than any other, embodied the quiet, sustaining labor that held society together. Offerings left at her feet were not extravagant treasures but baskets of produce, clay jars of oil, small loaves of bread, humble gifts from those who understood that survival, not splendor, was the true blessing. The myth of Proserpina's return was reflected in Rome's agricultural cycles. Each spring, as the fields sprouted green once more, it was said that Proserpina had emerged from the underworld, welcomed back by her mother's embrace. But this return was not dramatized. There were no parades with glittering chariots. Instead, it was marked by the soft rustle of new leaves, the subtle shift in air as farmers prepared their tools, their hands moving with practiced, unhurried gestures. Life resumed, as it always did, in a rhythm that was both sacred and mundane. Roman farmers, in their daily routines, reenacted this myth not through elaborate storytelling, but through the acts of plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Each furrow carved into the earth was a line in the story. Each seed dropped into the soil was a silent hope for Proserpina's return. They did not expect miracles. They expected the familiar sequence of work and reward, of patient tending and eventual yield. The myth provided a framework, a comforting narrative that framed the unpredictable whims of nature within a cycle that, while not guaranteed, was at least understood. Even in urban settings, small household shrines to Ceres and Proserpina could be found tucked into the corners of kitchens and courtyards. Families would offer bits of their meals, portions of bread or fruit, placed carefully upon stone ledges or within clay niches. The offerings were not grand, but they were sincere, habitual, folded into the rhythm of domestic life. To neglect these small acts was not seen as an affront to the gods' vanity, but as a lapse in one's responsibilities, a crack in the careful bureaucracy of rituals that kept life's fragile balance in place. In the Roman worldview, the relationship with the divine was not based on personal devotion or emotional worship. It was transactional, formal, and reciprocal. If the people performed the correct rites, the gods would fulfill their duties. This was not seen as irreverence, but as respect. The gods, like Rome itself, functioned on systems, on protocols that maintained order. The myth of Ceres and Proserpina was a reminder that even in matters of life, death, and renewal, there was a structure, a process, an agreement. When Romans attended the public games during the Cerealia, they did so with a sense of duty as much as entertainment. The chariot races, while thrilling, were part of the festival's rituals, their outcomes secondary to the performance of tradition. In the early morning, before the races began, foxes with burning torches tied to their tails would be released into the Circus Maximus. This peculiar ritual, though it may seem cruel or bizarre to modern sensibilities, was a symbolic gesture, a purification rite meant to protect the crops from blight and pestilence. It was not a spectacle of cruelty, but a prescribed act performed year after year with the same methodical cadence. To the Romans, the gods did not need constant adulation. They needed diligence, consistency, and respect for the formalities that connected heaven and earth. The myth of Ceres and Proserpina, with its soft undercurrent of loss and reunion, served as a gentle reminder that the cycles of nature were beyond human control, but not beyond human participation. Through rituals, offerings, and the steady continuation of tradition, Romans placed themselves within this cycle, not as masters, but as caretakers fulfilling their obligations. As evening descended upon the Roman fields, the soft glow of oil lamps flickered in farmhouses, casting long shadows upon walls where small icons of Ceres stood. The scent of freshly baked bread, warm and faintly sweet, drifted through the air, a quiet offering in itself. Outside, the earth rested, holding within it the countless seeds of Proserpina's story, waiting, as it always did, for the rhythm to turn once more. And so, as we close this chapter, and prepare to delve deeper into how these myths of earth and harvest were echoed in Rome's festivals, temples, and daily routines, we find that the gods of Rome were not distant thunderers or impassioned lovers. They were managers of cycles, overseers of routines. Their divine presence felt most keenly not in moments of spectacle, but in the quiet, repetitive tasks that filled each day. Tomorrow, we will walk through the agricultural rites that blurred the line between field and altar, where every plowed row was a prayer, every harvest a quiet celebration of Proserpina's return. There is something almost reverent about the way a Roman farmer moves through his fields at dawn. The gestures are unhurried, the pace deliberate, as if each footstep is a part of some ancient liturgy passed down not through sacred texts, but through the slow repetition of daily life. Long before the sun has lifted itself over the rolling hills, the farmer is already bending to the soil, his fingers brushing against the furrowed earth, not with affection, but with the quiet, practiced diligence of a ritual that has no clear beginning or end. This, for Rome, was worship. Not the grand ceremonies of the temples, not the gilded altars of the Capitoline Hill, but the mundane, ceaseless labor of the countryside, where gods like Ceres were honored with every seed planted, every plow turned, every quiet, expectant glance toward the sky. And yet, these simple acts were not born solely of Roman imagination. They echoed traditions far older, rituals whispered across the seas from the Greek city of Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries, those secretive, sacred rites of Demeter and Persephone, wove their influence into Roman soil. The Romans, ever pragmatic, adopted much from the Greeks, but they did not drape these borrowings in mysticism. Where Eleusis offered initiations into hidden knowledge, Rome offered processions through dusty streets, offerings of barley cakes, and the scratching of wooden plows over stone-laden fields. The mysteries became muted here, folded into the civic calendars, transformed into agricultural festivals that prioritized continuity over transcendence. The festival of the Cerealia, though Roman in name, carried the faintest echoes of Eleusinian practice. But unlike the mysteries, which guarded their sacred stories behind veils of secrecy, Rome laid its rituals bare for all to see. The goddess Ceres was honored not in darkened halls of initiates, but in the open air, amidst the laughter of children, the clatter of market stalls, and the steady hum of urban life. Offerings were made. Simple ones, like honey cakes, wine, and small figurines crafted from clay or dough. These were not grand gestures meant to awe the divine, but rather humble tokens of continuity, like receipts confirming that the necessary rites had been observed. In the countryside, far from the processions of the city, the rituals took on an even quieter form. Farmers would gather before dawn, their gatherings small, familial, sometimes no larger than a household. With bowls of grain and clay jugs of wine, they would step into their fields, whispering the ancient words that had been spoken for generations. There was no priest to lead these ceremonies, no official decree to sanction them. They were private, domestic acts of devotion, born out of the simple understanding that the earth was not to be taken for granted. These were not ceremonies of belief, they were ceremonies of habit, performed with the same certainty as mending a fence or repairing a roof, necessary, expected, and profoundly ordinary. The plow itself was an instrument of worship. As it carved slow, methodical lines through the soil, it reenacted the story of Ceres' patient search for Proserpina. Each furrow was a path, a journey, an offering. The creak of wooden wheels, the soft grunt of oxen, the steady rhythm of footsteps pressing down into the earth, these were the hymns of Roman devotion. There was no need for choirs or lyres when the work itself sang the song of the seasons. The farmer did not look to the sky in search of omens or miracles. He looked to the soil, knowing that the gods worked not through sudden gestures, but through the slow, reliable processes of growth and decay. Even the tools of the trade held a certain sacredness. the spade, the sickle, the woven baskets used to gather the grain. These were as much religious implements as the incense burners of the temples. Before the sowing season, tools would be cleaned and oiled, their wooden handles smoothed by careful hands. This was not done out of superstition, but out of a respect for the cyclical nature of life. To neglect the tools was to neglect the ritual. To neglect the ritual was to disrupt the delicate balance between human labor and divine order. During the Cerealia, a peculiar ritual unfolded in the Circus Maximus, where foxes with burning torches tied to their tails were released to run through the arena. The origins of this custom were old and murky, perhaps echoing ancient purifications or symbolic gestures against crop blight. Yet for the Romans, the ritual's purpose was less important than its repetition. It had always been done, therefore it must continue to be done. Spectators watched, but not with fervent excitement. It was a familiar scene, as regular and expected as the changing of the seasons themselves. The flames flickered, the foxes darted, and the ritual's meaning was preserved, not through understanding, but through the act of doing. Within the household, the domestic worship of Ceres took a quieter form. In small niches carved into walls or placed upon shelves, families kept tiny statues or painted images of the goddess. These household shrines, though modest, were focal points of daily reverence. A handful of grain might be offered before the morning meal, a splash of wine poured into a simple dish at the start of the evening. These acts were not grandiose proclamations of faith, but small, habitual gestures, a nod to the divine bureaucracy that oversaw the routines of life. It was not expected that Ceres would intervene directly. Rather, these offerings were acknowledgments of a larger system, a way of maintaining one's place within the unspoken agreements between gods and mortals. Unlike the fervent personal devotions found in other cultures, Roman religious life was a network of contracts and protocols. It was not about belief in the emotional sense, but about fulfilling one's civic and familial duties. This practicality infused even the myth of Ceres and Proserpina, stripping it of melodrama and leaving behind a story that was less about loss and more about maintenance, maintaining the cycles, maintaining the traditions, ensuring that the fields like the myths would continue to turn over, season after season. The Eleusinian mysteries may have promised their initiates secret knowledge and visions of the afterlife. But in Rome, such esoteric promises were exchanged for the tangible satisfaction of a well-tilled field and a successful harvest. The rituals were not about achieving spiritual transcendence, but about keeping the machinery of life operating smoothly. The gods were not distant, unknowable forces, but administrative overseers, quietly ensuring that the sun rose, the rain fell, and the grain sprouted in its time. Even the priesthood reflected this pragmatic approach. The Roman priestesses of Ceres, known as the daughters of Ceres, were not mystics or seers. They were caretakers, organizers of festivals, stewards of ritual practice. Their duties were clear, methodical, and public. They did not guard sacred secrets. They maintained public order. In their robes of unadorned white, they embodied the Roman ideal of piety, not as an emotional fervor, but as a calm, disciplined observance of duty. As the day drew to a close, the fields would fall silent once more. The low sun would cast long golden shadows across the stubbled earth, and the farmers would retreat to their homes, their tasks for the day completed with the same quiet precision as their ancestors. There was no climactic moment of spiritual revelation, no sudden rush of divine presence. Instead, there was the simple, steady satisfaction of having fulfilled one's part in the ongoing contract between man and nature, between mortal toil and divine order. In Rome, the echoes of Eleusis did not resound in whispered mysteries or ecstatic visions. They lived in the scratch of the plow, the weight of the harvest basket, the soft murmur of prayers spoken over loaves of bread. The mysteries were not hidden, they were lived, every day, In acts so ordinary they became sacred through their repetition. The myth of Ceres and Proserpina was not a story to be dramatically retold, but a pattern to be reenacted, quietly, endlessly, with each new season. And so, as we move forward to explore how even the temples of Ceres were not quite as sacred as one might imagine, we will find that in Rome, the boundary between the religious and the practical was always thin, porous, and beautifully dull. The gods did not demand awe. They required diligence. And in the rhythms of fields and festivals, that diligence was a worship all its own. The Temple of Ceres on Rome's Aventine Hill was, at first glance, everything a sacred building ought to be. Its columns stood tall, carved from pale stone that seemed to glow softly in the early morning light. The triangular pediment above was adorned with reliefs of grain sheaves, plump fruits, and the calm figure of Ceres herself, her arms cradling the symbols of fertility and harvest. Visitors climbing the worn steps might have expected to enter a hushed sanctuary, a place set apart from the noise and bustle of Roman life. But Rome rarely allowed its gods to live in isolation. The temples of this city were not places of private revelation. They were public, functional spaces, extensions of Rome's ceaseless administration, where sacredness was something woven into the routines of civic life, not elevated above it. The Temple of Ceres was a prime example of this blending. Situated near the bustling markets and the granaries that fed the city's vast population, it was less of a retreat for spiritual contemplation and more of a hub for managing the grain supply, recording legal proceedings, and providing a space where Rome's plebeians, the common citizens, could gather to settle disputes. On any given day, the temple's portico echoed not with chants or hymns, but with the low murmur of conversations, the rustle of scrolls, and the steady footsteps of magistrates carrying out their civic duties beneath the gaze of painted gods. The temple, you see, was never merely a house for the goddess. It was a center of administration, a warehouse for public records, a meeting hall for officials. The Romans, ever practical, saw no contradiction in blending the sacred with the mundane. In fact, it was this very combination that gave the temple its enduring significance. The divine and the bureaucratic coexisted comfortably here, each lending a certain weight and dignity to the other. When magistrates convened within its colonnades, when legal scribes unfurled their scrolls across its stone tables, they did so under the symbolic supervision of Ceres, whose role as the protector of grain and fertility extended naturally into the management of Rome's food supply, its laws, its people. Inside, the temple's interior was modest by the standards of Rome's more ostentatious shrines. There were no towering altars dripping with gold, no labyrinthine sanctuaries filled with exotic offerings. The walls were adorned with frescoes of pastoral scenes, fields of wheat rippling under a pale blue sky, farmers harvesting in rhythmic unison, baskets of fruit arrayed in orderly rows. These images were not designed to inspire awe, but to reflect a certain ideal of Roman life, the quiet, dependable labor that fed the city, the unassuming harmony between man, earth, and deity. The statue of Ceres herself stood in a simple niche carved from local marble, her features serene, matronly, and unmistakably Roman. In her right hand, she held a bundle of wheat, in her left, a torch, a subtle nod to her ceaseless search for Proserpina, though even that mythic journey, in Rome's retelling, had lost its tragic urgency, transformed into a symbol of patience and perseverance. Visitors did not fall to their knees in rapture before her. They offered small gestures, an amphora of oil placed at her feet, a pinch of grain scattered upon the altar stone, a whispered prayer that asked not for miracles but for stability. One might have expected the temple to be staffed by an order of priestesses shrouded in mystery, their rituals cloaked in secrecy. But in Rome, the caretakers of such sacred spaces were often as much public servants as they were religious functionaries. The priestesses of Ceres, known as the Daughters of Ceres, were respected for their discipline and dedication, but their duties were far from mystical. They organized festivals, oversaw the collection of offerings, and managed the practical aspects of temple life. They ensured that ceremonies were conducted according to proper protocol, that records were kept in order, and that the temple remained, above all else, a place where the gods' oversight merged seamlessly with the machinery of Rome's governance. The temple's role as a repository of public records was no minor detail. Important documents concerning land ownership, grain distribution, and legal disputes were stored within its stone chambers, stacked neatly upon wooden shelves or sealed in clay jars. The sanctity of these records was not purely religious, it was practical. By placing these documents under the watchful eyes of Ceres, Rome imbued its bureaucracy with a sense of divine order. The goddess who oversaw the fertility of the fields was also the guardian of contracts, decrees, and inventories. In this way, every ledger entry, every tally of grain reserves became, in a sense, a ritual act, an extension of the same meticulous care that went into planting and harvesting. The Temple of Ceres was also a space of judgment. In its shaded colonnades, the aediles, officials responsible for maintaining public order, held court, resolved disputes, and managed the distribution of food to the populace. When famine threatened or when grain prices fluctuated, it was beneath the temple's stone arches that decisions were made, negotiations conducted, and compromises brokered. The goddess herself, standing silently in her niche, did not intervene. Her presence was not a promise of divine intervention, but a reminder of the responsibilities that came with managing the city's lifeblood. During the Cerealia, the temple did see an increase in ritual activity, though even these festivities were marked more by their orderly structure than by any wild celebration. Processions would wind their way through the streets, with offerings of grain, cakes, and garlands carried by solemn-faced participants. The festival was less a burst of joyous revelry and more a confirmation that the necessary rites had been performed, that the ancient agreements between Rome and its gods remained intact for another year. The foxes in the Circus Maximus, the chariot races, the communal feasts, these were all parts of a well-maintained system, traditions repeated not out of passion, but out of the steady civic-minded recognition that rituals, like laws, were foundations upon which Rome's order was built. Even the architecture of the temple reflected this blending of sacred and civic purpose. The outer portico, with its broad steps and wide-open colonnades, was designed not to intimidate but to accommodate. It welcomed the flow of people, merchants settling accounts, citizens filing complaints, officials drafting decrees. The temple was not a fortress of divine mystery. It was an extension of the city's forums, a place where the boundaries between the human and the divine were less about spiritual transcendence and more about administrative cooperation. For the average Roman, visiting the Temple of Ceres was not an act of personal devotion, but a participation in a broader civic rhythm. One came not to seek personal miracles, but to ensure that the city's complex machinery of rituals and regulations continued to function smoothly. The gods did not demand rapture, they required correctness. A prayer misspoken, an offering neglected, a document misfiled. Such small errors could disrupt the fragile balance of favor that held Rome's fortunes together. Thus the temple was a place of quiet vigilance, where the sacred was not felt in moments of ecstatic worship, but in the steady, unremarkable maintenance of routine. As evening settled upon the Aventine Hill, the temple's stone walls would catch the fading light, glowing softly against the deepening sky. Inside, the scrolls remained in their niches, the statues stood silent, the offerings of the day collected and noted. The priests and magistrates would retreat to their homes, their duties for the day completed with the calm satisfaction of bureaucrats who understood that their work, though mundane, was essential. The temple would fall quiet, not in reverence, but in readiness, prepared to continue its role the next day, as it always had, as it always would. In Rome, the divine was never a distant, unfathomable force. It was a presence embedded within the very structures of the city, the very routines of its people. The Temple of Ceres was not a sacred retreat, but a working space, a testament to the Roman belief that the gods, like Rome itself, were at their most powerful, not in moments of passion, but in the ceaseless hum of duty, the quiet, endless turning of the wheel. And as we leave the temple behind, the soft murmurs of officials fading into the dusk, we will follow the story of Proserpina once more, tracing her gentle, predictable return to the surface, a ritual as patient, as repetitive, and as quietly reassuring as the city that honored it. Every spring in Rome, as the earth began its slow awakening from the damp chill of winter, a familiar story would unfold once more. It was not a tale of surprises, nor a drama that begged for reinvention. The return of Proserpina from the underworld was in truth a ritual of gentle inevitability, a story that the Romans knew by heart, recited not with theatrical flair, but with the quiet comfort of repetition. For them, myths were not meant to astonish. They were cycles, as predictable and necessary as the return of migratory birds, or the steady blooming of the first wildflowers pushing through the cracks in ancient cobblestones. The myth, as it was understood in Rome, told of Proserpina's time spent in the underworld with Dis, and her cyclical ascent back to the world of the living, prompted by the mourning, the pleading, and ultimately, the quiet persistence of her mother Ceres. Yet, where the Greek version emphasized emotion, Demeter's rage, her sorrow, her yearning, the Roman retelling dulled the sharp edges of feeling into a more resigned, almost bureaucratic arrangement. Proserpina's time was divided, negotiated like a contract, a portion of the year above, a portion below. It was not a story of defiance or loss, it was an agreement, a ritualized rhythm that Romans could understand, for their own lives were governed by such agreements, between citizens and magistrates, between families and the state, between mortals and gods. During the Cerealia, as the season of Proserpina's return was marked, the city stirred not with wild celebration, but with the steady, organized preparations that typified Roman festivals. Bakers would rise early to craft honey cakes, shaped like small flowers or sheaves of grain, their ovens filling the narrow streets with a warm, sweet scent. Processions would be planned with precision, ensuring that every participant knew their place, that every offering, whether of grain, wine, or woven garlands, was accounted for. It was not a festival of spontaneity, but of duty. Each act, from the smallest household libation to the grand parades moving through the forum, was a reaffirmation of the city's pact with its gods. Proserpina's return was less a moment of miraculous rebirth and more a gentle adjustment of the city's tempo. Market stalls would display early produce with a sense of quiet pride, their piles of fresh greens and young fruits symbolizing not the triumph of life over death, but the simple, steady promise of continuity. There was no eruption of joy, no cathartic release. Instead, there was a deep, collective exhale, a recognition that the necessary rites had been performed, the appropriate offerings made, and that, for another season, the machinery of life would continue to turn. In rural communities, far from the marble temples of the capital, the story of Proserpina's return was enacted in the most unassuming of ways. Farmers would observe the subtle changes in the landscape, the softening of the earth beneath their feet, the appearance of tiny buds on dormant vines, as if they were signs of a contract being quietly renewed. Before the day's labor began, families might gather in the early light, offering a simple meal to Ceres and Proserpina, a loaf of bread, a cup of wine, a scattering of fresh herbs. There were no priests to oversee these acts, no formal liturgies to recite. The gestures were small, personal, and deeply habitual, woven into the rhythms of life as seamlessly as the sowing of seeds or the sharpening of tools. Even within the city, households maintained their own modest observances. In the corners of kitchens or by the thresholds of homes, tiny altars would bear offerings of flowers or bits of fruit. Children might be tasked with placing garlands of violets, said to be Proserpina's favorite, upon these humble shrines, their small hands performing a duty older than memory. It was not a question of belief or piety in the emotional sense. It was simply what was done, year after year, generation after generation. The gods did not require ecstasy. They required steadiness. In this way, the story of Proserpina became less about mythic drama and more about the comfort of routine. Her descent and return mirrored the cycles that governed every aspect of Roman life. The rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the endless predictable rotations of public office and family obligations. The Romans found solace in this repetition. For a people whose lives were marked by rigid schedules, civic duties, and unchanging traditions, the myth of Proserpina was not a narrative to be marveled at, but a reassurance that, beneath the ever-changing surface of the world, the essential rhythms remained intact. The processions honoring Ceres and Proserpina moved slowly through Rome's streets, accompanied by the soft shuffle of sandaled feet and the faint clink of bronze vessels. There were no wild shouts, no frenzied dances. Instead, there was a calm, measured solemnity to the rituals. Participants carried their offerings with care, their movements choreographed not by passion but by protocol. The foxes released in the Circus Maximus, their tails alight with small torches, were not symbols of chaos but of purification. A ritual act whose meaning had grown obscure, yet whose practice remained essential. It had always been done, therefore it would continue to be done. Even the art and literature that depicted Proserpina's tale often lacked the emotional intensity found in Greek versions. Roman mosaics portrayed her ascent with quiet dignity, her figure stepping lightly from shadowed caverns into sunlit meadows, greeted not by wild exultation, but by the calm, expectant presence of Ceres. Poets described her return with language that was formal, restrained, focusing less on the emotional reunion and more on the ceremonial correctness of the event. The story was not about catharsis. It was about maintenance, the maintenance of cosmic order, of social contracts, of agricultural cycles. The temples would mark Proserpina's return with prescribed ceremonies, but these were not spectacles designed to inspire awe. They were performances of duty, where every gesture, every phrase, every offering was carried out with meticulous care. The priestesses overseeing the rites did so not as conduits of divine ecstasy, but as administrators ensuring that the necessary steps were followed, that no detail was overlooked. The incense that drifted lazily into the air was measured, the prayers spoken in tones that were steady, almost monotonous. The aim was not to stir the heart, but to reassure the mind that all was in order. To modern sensibilities accustomed to tales of gods and myths imbued with drama and emotion, such an approach might seem curiously dull. But for the Romans, the dullness was the point. The very act of repeating these rituals year after year, with little change or variation, was itself a kind of worship. It was not the passion of the moment that mattered, but the perseverance of the tradition. Proserpina's return was not a moment of narrative climax. It was a gentle, rhythmic pulse that kept time with the heart of the city itself. As the festival days drew to a close, there would be no grand finale, no crescendo of celebration. The processions would disband quietly, the offerings would be cleared away, and the city would return to its usual routines. There was no need for dramatic conclusions, for the story was never truly over. It would return again and again, as reliable as the seasons. The myth did not demand belief in the fantastical, it required only participation in the cycle. To take part in the rituals was to acknowledge one's place within a pattern far older than any individual, a pattern that did not need to be exciting to be sacred. And so, The story of Proserpina's return, in the Roman imagination, became a gentle affirmation of continuity. It was not a tale that captured the breathless attention of its listeners, but rather a soft murmur that accompanied them through the rhythms of their lives. A story to be lived, not told. A myth that, like the turning of the plow or the sifting of grain, was beautiful in its predictability. As we now move forward, leaving behind the quiet cycles of Proserpina's journey, we turn to a different kind of god. A god not of fields and harvests, but of beginnings and endings, of thresholds and transitions. A god whose presence was felt not in grand narratives, but in every doorway passed, every journey begun, every quiet moment of stepping from one space into another. In the next part, we will open the creaking wooden door to the story of Janus, the two-faced god who watched over Rome's countless passages, always present, always patient, never needing to move to be everywhere at once. There was a time, long before the grand marble temples and the sweeping forums, when the gods of Rome were simpler, quieter figures. They were not yet adorned with the intricate myths of later centuries. They were forces of function, guardians of the everyday, woven into the unnoticed movements of daily life. Among them was Janus, perhaps the most Roman of them all. A god without a Greek counterpart, a god whose power lay not in dramatic tales of conquest or love, but in the most mundane, persistent act of transition. Janus, the two-faced god, was the patron of doorways, gates, passages, and thresholds. His domain was not the vast sky or the wild seas, but the simple act of crossing from one place to another, from one moment to the next. One of Janus's faces looked to the past, while the other faced forward into the future. Yet, he was not a figure of philosophical pondering, but a guardian of practical beginnings. He was invoked at the start of every endeavor, whether grand or humble. The first step of a journey, the opening of a door, the first words of a speech, the breaking of the morning's bread, all these small acts of commencement were, in their own quiet way, sacred to Janus. The Romans, pragmatic as they were, found solace in his constant presence. Janus did not intervene in the affairs of mortals. He simply watched patiently as they moved through the inevitable series of transitions that life demanded. There was no singular grand temple for Janus that rivaled the towering shrines of Jupiter or Mars. His most iconic sanctuary was a modest structure near the Forum, known simply as the Janus Geminis. It was a small, arched gateway with the double doors, often left open to signify times of war and closed to mark rare moments of peace. Yet, this temple was less a house for a god and more a symbolic passage, a physical representation of Janus's constant guardianship over Rome's movements in and out of conflict. The act of opening and closing these gates was not rushed or dramatic. It was a slow, deliberate ceremony, performed with the kind of measured precision that defined so much of Roman ritual life. There was no need to summon Janus with elaborate invocations. He was already there, at every hinge and threshold, observing quietly. In every Roman household, Janus was honored at the doorway. Small, unadorned shrines would sit by the entrance, simple stone markers or wooden carvings bearing his two-faced image. As family members stepped over the threshold in the morning, they might offer a murmured word, a touch to the shrine, a small libation of wine spilled onto the earth. These were not acts of fervent devotion. They were habitual acknowledgments, brief and undramatic, as natural as the tying of a sandal strap or the adjusting of a tunic. Janus did not demand elaborate offerings. His favor was found in the recognition of his place in the small moments, the quiet transitions that marked the passage of a Roman day. The Kalends of January, the first day of the new year, was dedicated to Janus. But even this festival, in the Roman sense, lacked the jubilant, frenzied atmosphere of other cultures' New Year celebrations. It was a time of gifts, of simple tokens exchanged between family, friends, and clients. Honeyed dates, figs, coins stamped with Janus's dual visage. The gifts were small, symbolic gestures meant to secure goodwill and smooth transitions into the months ahead. The ceremonies held in Janus's honor were restrained, focused more on the correct performance of rites than on emotional spectacle. Priests, their heads veiled, would chant prayers that were precise, methodical, invoking Janus not as a deity to be petitioned for favors, but as a guardian whose presence ensured the proper unfolding of time. Janus was, in many ways, a bureaucrat's god. His essence was embedded in the formalities of process, in the sequences that ordered Roman life. He watched over every official decree as it was unsealed, every new magistrate as they took their oaths, every soldier as they stepped from civilian life into military service. These transitions were not moments of personal revelation. They were procedural necessities, as vital and unremarkable as the opening of a ledger or the rolling out of a scroll. In this, Janus represented a uniquely Roman understanding of the sacred, not as a realm apart from the world, but as a constant background hum that lent structure to life's incessant march forward. In art, Janus was rarely depicted with grandeur. His two faces, serene and expressionless, lacked the emotive flourishes seen in portrayals of Jupiter's thunderous scowl or Venus's tender smile. His imagery was functional, emblematic. Coins bearing his likeness were circulated not as devotional tokens, but as everyday currency, passed from hand to hand in the routines of commerce. His sacredness was thus felt not in moments of spiritual elevation, but in the touch of cold metal, in the act of exchange, in the thousand small beginnings that comprised Roman daily life. When Romans spoke of Janus moments, they did not refer to grand turning points, but to the quiet instants where one phase gave way to another. The opening of a door, the start of a journey, the breaking of dawn. To be under Janus's gaze was to be in transit, to be moving, however slightly, from the old into the new. Yet this constant movement was not a cause for anxiety. In Rome's view, life was a sequence of such passages, and Janus's role was to ensure that each transition, no matter how minor, was performed correctly. The correctness mattered more than the result. A journey begun with the proper invocation of Janus was a journey aligned with the orderly flow of time, regardless of where it might lead. The gates of Janus, in the Forum, stood as a public barometer of Rome's state of affairs. When the gates were closed, it was said that peace reigned. Yet in Rome's long and restless history, such closures were rare. And even when they occurred, the act was carried out with an almost perfunctory sense of duty. There were no crowds cheering in the streets, no lavish feasts. A priest would approach, accompanied by magistrates, and the gates would be swung shut with the slow, heavy creak of bronze on stone. It was a ritual that acknowledged peace not as an ecstatic celebration, but as a temporary, delicate pause in the city's continuous motion. Janus, unlike other gods, did not inhabit a mythic Olympus or a dramatic narrative arc. His domain was the present moment, the hinge upon which every before and after swung gently. He was both ancient and immediate, his presence felt in every creak of a door, every step across a threshold, every first word uttered in a new endeavor. To worship Janus was to participate in the rituals of beginning, to understand that every commencement, no matter how small, deserved its own moment of acknowledgement. In this way, the Romans did not merely believe in Janus, they lived with him. He was in the physical spaces they passed through, the procedures they followed, the customs they repeated. His divinity was quiet, procedural, and ever-present. He was not a god of stories, but a god of moments, and the Romans, with their love of order and process, found in him a reflection of their own understanding of how the sacred could be embedded within the mundane. And as we pass through the quiet, shadowed gateway of his temple, we move gently into the next part of our story. We will pause to observe how the gates of Janus, those silent markers of peace and war, were opened and closed, not with urgency, but with the calm, rhythmic precision that the Romans valued above all else. For in Rome, Even the declaration of peace was a ceremony of patience, a ritual not of emotion, but of formality. In the heart of Rome, where the ancient streets converged in a quiet rhythm of sandals against stone, stood a small, unassuming structure that, despite its modesty, held a symbolic weight far greater than its size. The Janus Geminis, a simple double-doored gateway near the Forum, was not a temple in the grand sense of the word. There were no towering columns, no sweeping porticos. It was instead a passage, a gateway that stood open or closed, marking the city's silent accord with war and peace. It was here that Janus, the god of thresholds and transitions, kept watch over Rome's state of affairs, not with thunder or spectacle, but with the slow swing of bronze doors that moved only when ceremony required. For most of Rome's history, those gates stood open. Rome, ever ambitious, ever expanding, was rarely at peace. Yet, this constant state of warfare did not stir the Romans into passionate declarations or frenzied war cries. The opening of Janus's gates was a matter of procedure, a solemn acknowledgement that Rome was engaged in the necessary business of conquest. It was not an event marked by excitement, but by a quiet acceptance of duty. The priests, known as pontifices, would gather with the magistrates, their procession moving through the Forum at a slow, deliberate pace. There were no crowds cheering them on, no flares of emotion. The ceremony was measured, each step part of an old and well-rehearsed ritual, as predictable as the tolling of a temple bell. When the time came to open the gates, the act itself was almost mundane. The heavy bronze doors, aged and weathered, would swing wide with a groan that echoed gently against the stone walls. It was not a theatrical gesture. There was no flourish, no dramatic unveiling. It was simply the completion of a civic duty, a marking of status. Rome was at war, and the gates stood open as a visible symbol of that fact. The god Janus, who watched over beginnings, transitions, and passages, was not called upon to lead armies or intervene in battle. His role was to observe the crossing from peace into conflict, to stand silently as Rome moved forward into its next inevitable campaign. What is perhaps most striking about this ritual is its lack of urgency. In a modern sense, one might expect such a declaration of war to be accompanied by fiery speeches, by a swell of patriotic fervor. But for the Romans, the act of opening Janus's gates was more akin to filing official paperwork, a necessary formality that ensured the proper alignment of divine order and human action. The gods were not interested in the passions of mortals. They cared for precision, for the correct execution of rituals that maintained the balance of the cosmos. The opening of the gates was, in this light, a quiet procedural crossing from one state to another, performed not out of emotion but out of obligation. Closing the gates of Janus, however, was a far rarer occurrence. Peace, in Rome's restless narrative, was an unusual guest, and when it came, it was not met with jubilant celebration, but with a solemn, almost awkward ceremony. The process was much the same as when the gates were opened, a slow, formal procession, the priests veiled, the magistrates in their official garb, moving through the Forum with a pace that suggested not triumph, but careful adherence to tradition. The bronze doors, untouched for years, would be eased shut, their movements slow and deliberate, as if the very act of closure needed to be coaxed into existence. It is said that during the long reign of Augustus, the gates were closed, marking a rare and precious moment of peace. Yet, even then, the ceremony was conducted with the same measured calmness, the same procedural detachment. The city did not erupt into a frenzy of celebration. Instead, the closure was observed with a kind of collective exhale, a recognition that, for a brief time, the machinery of war had been paused. The people continued with their daily routines, their prayers, their offerings. Peace was not a spectacle. It was a shift in status, a line crossed in the great ledger of Rome's affairs. The gates themselves were not symbols of grandeur. They were simple, functional structures, bearing the weight of their meaning not in appearance, but in context. Their significance lay in their ability to quietly announce Rome's stance to the gods and to the world. Open meant war. Closed meant peace. But neither state was cause for emotional outpouring. Both were simply parts of the endless cycle that Rome navigated with a sense of procedural calm. The priests who managed these ceremonies approached their duties with the same meticulous care that governed all aspects of Roman religious life. Every step, every gesture, every word spoken during the rituals was scripted, ancient, and unchanging. The act of opening or closing Janus's gates was not about invoking divine favor through passion or plea. It was about ensuring that the correct forms were followed, that the city remained in alignment with the sacred order that bound gods and mortals alike. To perform the ritual incorrectly was unthinkable, not because it would offend Janus in an emotional sense, but because it would disrupt the delicate balance of ritual propriety that underpinned Rome's relationship with the divine. Even in private life, the concept of Janus's gates resonated in subtle, habitual ways. Every threshold crossed, every doorway passed, was a miniature echo of the larger ritual. Romans would offer a brief nod, a small word of recognition to Janus as they stepped through their own household doors, as if acknowledging that, in their own small way, they too were crossing from one state to another. These gestures were not dramatic acts of faith. They were quiet acknowledgments, brief formalities performed without fanfare, yet essential in maintaining the rhythm of life's transitions. Janus himself remained an ever-present figure, not as a character in tales of love or war, but as a silent observer, a guardian of passages both physical and temporal. His two faces did not look out over the grand narratives of heroes and gods. Instead, they watched over the simple, persistent act of moving forward, of stepping from what has been into what is yet to be. He was there in the creak of a door hinge, in the first light of dawn slipping through a window, in the quiet moment before the start of a speech or the sealing of a contract. The opening and closing of his gates in the Forum was but the largest, most public echo of these countless small transitions that filled Roman life. To the Romans, the divine was rarely about grand gestures. It was about the correct performance of duties, the seamless integration of sacred acts into the mundane fabric of daily existence. The gates of Janus, in their simplicity, embodied this principle perfectly. They did not need to be monumental or adorned. Their power lay in their function. To open or close them was to affirm Rome's place within the ordered flow of time and fate, to signal a shift not with a roar, but with a whisper of ancient bronze brushing against stone. And as we step away from the quiet symbolism of Janus' gates, we find ourselves drawn toward the smaller, more intimate spaces where the divine continued to dwell. Not in temples or public rituals, but within the very homes of Rome's citizens. For the gods of the hearth, the Lares and Penates offered a different kind of guardianship. They were not concerned with the movements of armies or the declarations of war and peace. Their domain was the household, the simple act of living, where worship was a daily habit, as quiet and essential as breathing. In the next part, we will step gently across the threshold and into the world of everyday worship, where small shrines and small prayers kept the presence of the gods alive in the most unassuming corners of Roman life. In the grand narratives of gods and empires, it is easy to overlook the quiet rituals that unfolded behind the simple wooden doors of Roman homes. Yet, for most Romans, the divine was not something distant, waiting in marble temples or in the heights of Olympus. The gods lived much closer, within the walls of their houses, perched quietly on small shelves, watching over the steady, uneventful rhythms of daily life. This was the domain of the Lares and Penates, the household gods, whose presence was as constant and ordinary as the warmth of the hearth or the scent of bread baking in the morning. Each Roman home had its lararium, a small, often unadorned shrine tucked into a corner of the atrium or near the kitchen, where the family would offer quiet gestures of reverence to their household spirits. The lares were guardian spirits of place, protectors of the home and its inhabitants, while the penates watched over the family's provisions, ensuring that the pantry was never bare, that the fire was never cold. Their images were simple, often small figurines of terracotta or bronze, sometimes painted, sometimes left plain, standing beneath a tiny arch, or resting on a shelf that bore the blackened marks of countless offerings. Worship in these spaces was not a grand affair. There were no choirs, no elaborate chants. It was a ritual of habit, performed as naturally and rhythmically as sweeping the floor or lighting a lamp. In the early hours, as dawn's pale light began to creep through shuttered windows, the master of the house or the matron might approach the lararium with a small offering, a morsel of food, a splash of wine, a pinch of incense. The gesture was soft, almost automatic. There was no expectation of a divine response. The gods of the household did not thunder or whisper. They simply observed, steady and silent, as life unfolded around them. The prayers offered to the lares and penates were brief, formulaic, and spoken with a tone of calm familiarity. They were not pleas for miracles or interventions. They were instead acknowledgments, a way of maintaining a relationship, of keeping the sacred present in the simplest tasks. Lars familiaris, one might murmur, guard our home, guard our table, as you have always done. And with that, the day would continue. The fire would be stoked, bread kneaded, the hum of daily chores filling the space where prayers had been softly uttered just moments before. Children grew up watching these rituals, absorbing them not as moments of religious awakening, but as part of the ordinary cadence of family life. To offer a crumb of bread to the lares before sitting down to a meal was no different than washing one's hands or straightening one's tunic. It was not a matter of belief in the dramatic sense, but of custom, of quiet continuity. The household gods did not demand attention. They simply received it, gently, in the repetitive gestures that tied each morning to the next. Even in the wealthier homes, where the lararium might be crafted of marble and adorned with painted frescoes, the nature of worship remained the same: unassuming, habitual, soft. The flicker of a small oil lamp, the faint tendrils of incense smoke curling lazily upward, the faint clink of a small offering bowl. These were the sounds and sights of Roman piety at its most personal. There was no spectacle, no congregation, just a family, a hearth, and the quiet acknowledgement of the divine's patient presence. The lares were also honored at crossroads, where small shrines dotted the city streets and countryside paths. These were simple altars, built of stacked stones or small niches carved into walls, where passers-by might pause for a moment, place a coin, or whisper a word of safe passage. Here, too, worship was not about grand emotion, but about maintaining the proper forms, ensuring that each journey, no matter how brief, was accompanied by the correct gestures of respect. The gods of the crossroads did not intervene with signs or visions. They simply watched as travelers passed, their offerings left in small piles that grew slowly, day by day. In times of family celebration, such as marriages or births, the lares and penates were honored with slightly more elaborate offerings: cakes sweetened with honey, fruits, small garlands of flowers. But even these acts were marked by a kind of restrained joy. The ceremonies were less about seeking divine favor and more about fulfilling a long-standing rhythm, participating in an ongoing cycle of giving and acknowledgement that had endured through countless generations. There was comfort in the familiarity of it, in the knowledge that these simple acts connected one's household to the vast, unchanging order of Roman life. The Roman sense of the sacred was, at its core, deeply practical. The gods were not expected to be intimate companions or miraculous saviors. They were part of the structure of life itself, woven into the fabric of routines that required no dramatic affirmations of faith. To honor them correctly was to live correctly, to align oneself with the quiet, procedural harmony that ensured stability and order. In the lararium, this philosophy found its most tangible expression. The divine was not distant, but it was not intrusive either. It was there in the corner of the room, receiving a small portion of every day, steady and silent. The hearth itself was a sacred space, tended not with passion, but with steady care. The flame, considered the life force of the household, was never allowed to die out without ritual closure. The act of tending the fire was as much a devotional act as a domestic one. Each log added, each flick of ash cleared away, was part of a continuous offering, an unspoken prayer that did not need to be articulated. The warmth that filled the home, the crackle of burning wood, these were the sounds of both comfort and worship. Even in the humbler homes of Rome, where the lararium might be no more than a niche in a cracked plaster wall, the rituals were performed with the same quiet diligence. The gods did not favor the wealthy over the poor. What mattered was the continuity of respect, the simple acts performed without expectation of reward. For the Romans, piety was not a matter of emotion, but of correctness, of maintaining the proper relationships through the correct forms, no matter how small or mundane those forms might appear. It is in these small, repetitive gestures that we begin to understand the Roman approach to the divine. There was no need for every act of worship to be filled with wonder or awe. In fact, the most sacred moments were often the quietest. The slight bow of the head when passing a shrine, the careful placement of a fig on an altar, the murmured prayers that accompanied daily tasks. The gods were not absent, but neither were they overwhelming presences. They lived within the routines, the customs, the soft, unnoticed details of everyday life. As evening fell and shadows lengthened across the tiled floors, families would once again approach their household shrines, offering a final word of thanks, a last small gesture of acknowledgement before the day ended. The lares and penates remained, watching over the quiet stillness of sleeping homes, their presence not felt in miraculous visions, but in the simple peace of a household resting in the soft glow of its own familiar rituals. And as we leave these quiet Roman homes behind, we turn next to a group of priestesses whose duties were perhaps the most iconic and yet the most quietly tedious of all. The Vestal Virgins, keepers of the sacred fire of Rome, performed their rituals not with spectacle, but with relentless, patient care. Their world was one of silence, of discipline, of ceaseless attention to detail. In the next part, we will step into the marble halls where the Vestals swept, tended, and watched, guardians not of myths or legends, but of a flame that was sacred precisely because it never changed. Thus, the Vestal Virgins, with their endless sweeping, their careful tending of the sacred fire, and their patient, silent watchfulness, embodied the Roman understanding of devotion, not as an ecstatic encounter with the divine, but as a quiet, unchanging ritual, woven into the fabric of daily life. Their world was one of discipline and steadiness, where sacredness was measured not in miracles, but in the simple fact that the fire never went out. And as we leave their marble halls behind, with the faint scent of ash lingering in the air, we turn our gaze outward to the city itself, where festivals filled the calendar not with celebration, but with obligations. In the next part, we will walk through these festivals, long days of processions, offerings, and rituals that felt, to many Romans, less like joyous holidays and more like work. A slow, procedural work that was done year after year, not out of passion, but out of duty.